The Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, Madison Square Garden, the Chrysler Building, over 1,000 warships that helped win World War II. One company built all of it. Not a country, not a government program. One company. From a small town in Pennsylvania, with American steel, American workers, and American hands. At its peak, that company employed 300,000 people. The CEO personally promised President Roosevelt that they would build one ship per day. He delivered 380 in a single year. That company was Bethlehem Steel. And on October 15th, 2001, it filed for bankruptcy. I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened. All of it. Because the story that textbooks give you, Japan did it, imports killed it, that's only a quarter of the truth. The full story is uglier, more human. And at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you what Jack Welch, the man Fortune called the greatest CEO of the century, said when someone asked if he could have saved Bethlehem Steel. His answer? You won't forget. The Empire State Building. You've seen it 1,000 times. That Art Deco tower, cutting the New York sky. Finished in 1931, still standing, still one of the most recognized structures on Earth. What most people don't know is that 57,000 tons of steel went into that building. Every beam, every column, every floor plate. And almost all of it came from one place. A 5-mile complex along the Lehigh River in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Golden Gate Bridge, another 68,000 tons, same place. The Hoover Dam, the George Washington Bridge, Madison Square Garden, Alcatraz Island, the Chrysler Building, the Ben Franklin Bridge. Same place, same company. Bethlehem Steel. And in October 2001, a company that had been building America's physical infrastructure for nearly 150 years filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At that point, Bethlehem Steel had 13,000 employees left and 74,000 pensioners depending on the company for their retirement. That ratio alone tells you almost everything about what went wrong. But it doesn't tell you everything. Not even close.
Let's go back to the beginning. 1857, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. A businessman named Augustus Woolley had an idea. The railroads were expanding across America at a pace nobody had ever seen. Somebody needed to make the iron rails. He founded the Saucona Iron Company. It almost died immediately. The Panic of 1857, one of the first major financial crises in American history, hit within months of the founding. Iron prices collapsed. The company barely survived its first year. But survive it did. By 1861, the Civil War had started, and suddenly demand for iron rails, and for something else entirely, went through the roof. Cannons, armor plate, military equipment. The Bethlehem Iron Company, as it had been renamed, won government contracts for Navy ordnance. They were building America's war machine before the country even knew it had one. Then came Charles Schwab. Not the stockbroker, a different Charles Schwab. Charles M. Schwab, a steel man who had made his name at U.S. Steel, the giant that J.P. Morgan had assembled from Carnegie's empire. In 1901, Schwab bought Bethlehem Steel Company. In 1904, he formally incorporated Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And then he did something that changed urban architecture forever. He bet the entire company on a new invention. A mill designed by an engineer named Henry Gray. It could roll what became known as the wide-flanged structural beam, a section of steel that was stronger, lighter, and cheaper than anything being used at the time. The Gray beam. You might not know that now, but you walked inside buildings held up by it your entire life. That beam made the modern skyscraper possible. Not possible in theory, possible in practice, at a price that cities could actually afford to pay. Before the Gray beam, buildings couldn't go past about 10 stories. After it, 50, 70, 100. Bethlehem Steel didn't just build America's landmarks, it invented the technology that made those landmarks structurally possible. By 1914, Bethlehem was producing more steel than any other company in America except U.S. Steel, and World War I was about to make them even bigger. But before we get to the wars, I need to show you something, because
By the 1930s, Bethlehem Steel was everywhere. The Golden Gate Bridge, 1937. The bridge that defines San Francisco. The bridge that appears in every disaster movie, every postcard, every love song about California. Bethlehem supplied most of the steel, 68,000 tons. Custom-coated with a red primer, still visible today, designed specifically to resist the corrosion of San Francisco's salty air. The Empire State Building, 1931, completed in just 410 days. That's physically impossible without steel arriving on schedule, cut to specification, ready to bolt. Bethlehem delivered 57,000 tons in weeks. The building went up at an average of 4.5 floors per week. 4.5 floors per week in 1930. And then there was the Hoover Dam, the George Washington Bridge, Alcatraz, Madison Square Garden. Bethlehem Steel wasn't just making America's iconic structures. It was the reason those structures could exist at that scale, at that speed, at that price. At its peak in the 1930s and 1940s, the Bethlehem plant in Pennsylvania stretched 5 miles along the Lehigh River. 5 miles. It was the size of a small city, because it was a small city. In 1940, 40% of the entire population of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, residents included, depended directly or indirectly on the steel plant for their livelihood. And then came the war, and everything changed again. World War II, 1941. America suddenly needed ships, lots of them, faster than anyone had ever built ships before. Eugene Grace, Bethlehem CEO, made a personal promise to President Roosevelt in 1943. He said Bethlehem would produce 1 ship per day. 1 ship per day. He didn't just keep that promise, he beat it. 380 ships in a single year. Bethlehem Steel's 15 shipyards. Here's the part of this story that nobody wants to talk about, because it's not a story about foreign competition. Not entirely. It's a story about what happens when you win so completely that you stop paying attention. When World War II ended, America emerged as the only major industrial power with its factories still standing. Germany's steel industry bombed flat. Japan's, same. Britain, struggling. That meant that for roughly 20 years after the war, from 1945 to the mid-1960s, Bethlehem Steel and U.S. Steel had no real competition. None. They could charge almost whatever they wanted. They could sign labor contracts that seemed generous but were actually time bombs. They could skip investing in new technology because the old technology still worked fine. Why spend money on continuous casting, a new process that produced better steel more efficiently, when your outdated blast furnaces were still turning a profit? That logic made sense in 1955. It was catastrophic by 1975. Because while Bethlehem was coasting, Germany and Japan were rebuilding their steel industries from scratch. Not with 1930s technology, with 1960s technology. Continuous casting, oxygen furnaces, automated rolling mills. Their new plants were more efficient, produced higher quality steel, and cost significantly less to operate than Bethlehem's aging equipment. By the 1970s, imported steel from Japan was arriving in the United States at prices that Bethlehem literally could not match. Not because Japanese workers were paid less, though they were, because Japanese factories were producing steel in fundamentally better ways. And here's what Bethlehem's management did in response. They lobbied Congress for tariff protection. So, we've seen how Bethlehem built everything, and we've seen the first cracks appearing. But I promised you something at the start. I told you the "Japan did it" story is only a quarter of the truth. We haven't gotten to the real killer yet. It wasn't Japan. It wasn't the minimills. It was something much closer to home. Something the company itself created, over decades, one labor contract at a time. Stay with me, because this next part is the part that changes everything. Let me give you a number. In 1957, Bethlehem Steel's peak year, the company employed 167,000 workers. By 1982, that number had dropped to 35,000. That's a loss of 132,000 jobs in 25 years. In a company, in a region, in Pennsylvania towns where the mill was the only employer that mattered. But here's the thing about Bethlehem Steel that never makes it into the simple version of this story. When you employed 167,000 workers at peak wages with full benefits, and you made those promises in labor contracts that ran for decades, you didn't just employ those people. You promised to support them forever. Pensions, health care, retirement benefits. By the time Bethlehem filed for bankruptcy in 2001, the company had 13,000 active employees and 74,000 pensioners. Read that again. 13,000 workers generating revenue, supporting 74,000 retirees depending on the company's survival. Every dollar earned by an active worker had to stretch not just to cover operations, but to fund a pension obligation that was structurally impossible to sustain. Jack Welch, General Electric's legendary CEO, the man Fortune magazine named the greatest manager of the 20th century, was once asked if he thought he could have saved Bethlehem Steel. His answer was immediate. I don't think Christ himself could have saved it. 1982. That year, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion. In 1 year, they shut down plants, they laid off workers, they exited businesses, railroad cars in 1993, shipbuilding in 1997. Each time, they were trying to cut enough to survive. Each time, they were also reducing the revenue base that needed to support those pension obligations. It was a death spiral with no exit. In 1988, profitability briefly returned. For a moment, it looked like the restructuring might work. Bethlehem stock climbed. Analysts wrote cautiously optimistic reports. But the structural problem hadn't been fixed. It had only been deferred. The pension obligations were still there. The aging plants were still there. The competitive gap with Japan and the mini-mills were still there. And the 1990s brought more pain, more closures.
September 24, 2001, 17 days after the September 11 attacks. Bethlehem Steel's board replaced its CEO. They brought in Robert S. Miller, a turnaround specialist, the same man who had led the financial negotiations that resulted in the Chrysler bailout in the 1980s. If anyone could save a dying industrial giant, it was Bob Miller. He lasted 3 weeks before concluding there was no way out. On October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company reported a quarterly loss of $152 million. It had lost $1.4 billion in the first 9 months of 2001 alone. Chapter 11 does not solve our problems, Miller said in his statement. It provides us a process and framework within which we can address and explore the significant issues facing the company. That's the most honest thing any executive had said about Bethlehem Steel in years. The bankruptcy filing triggered immediate consequences. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private pensions, took over Bethlehem's pension obligations. But taking over didn't mean making whole. The PBGC had limits on what it could pay. For many of Bethlehem's 74,000 pensioners, workers who had spent 30, 35, 40 years in those furnaces, it meant a significant cut in what they had been promised. People who had been told repeatedly that their retirement was secure
discovered that it wasn't. Not because they had done anything wrong, because the company they had built with their labor over their careers had made promises it could no longer keep. A Harvard Business School case study published in 2002 captured what this felt like at the human level. A daughter, an MBA student, trying to figure out if her father's pension would survive, while grieving both the company's collapse and the September 11 attacks happening simultaneously. That was the reality of Bethlehem's end. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened to real families, real people, people who had done everything right.
In 2003, International Steel Group, a private equity firm, acquired Bethlehem Steel's assets for $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion. For a company that had, at its peak, generated over $1 billion in annual profit. For a company that had built the physical backbone of the most powerful nation in the 20th century. $1.5 billion. 2 years later, ISG merged with Mittal Steel, the Indian-owned global giant. And in 2006, Mittal merged with Arcelor to form ArcelorMittal, today the second largest steel producer in the world. The assets of Bethlehem Steel, one of America's proudest industrial institutions, are now owned by a Luxembourg-registered multinational of Indian origin. There is no version of that fact that isn't a little bit devastating. Today, the main Bethlehem plant is a cultural venue called Steel Stacks. Concerts, arts festivals, a national museum of industrial history. The blast furnaces are still there, preserved, lit at night. They're beautiful, actually. And if you stand underneath them, those 5 towers of rust and steel that once burned day and night to build the Brooklyn Bridge and the battleships that beat fascism, you feel something complicated. Pride, loss, anger, wonder. The 5-mile complex that employed 30,000 people now employs a few hundred in hospitality and arts. The city of Bethlehem survived. It had to reinvent itself. It did, to its credit. But what was lost can't be replaced. Not by a concert venue. Not by a casino. Not by a museum.
So what actually killed Bethlehem Steel? Was it Japan? Partly. Was it the mini-mills? Partly. Was it the pensions? Yes, but the pension obligations were the result of decades of labor negotiations that made sense in an era of monopoly and became fatal the moment competition arrived. Was it management? Absolutely. Management that chose denial over adaptation, that lobbied for tariffs instead of investing in technology, that kept paying massive executive bonuses while the company bled. Jack Welch said Christ himself couldn't have saved it. I think Jack Welch was being diplomatic. Because the truth is more uncomfortable. Bethlehem Steel didn't die because of forces beyond anyone's control. It died because the people running it for 2 decades made choices that prioritized short-term comfort over long-term survival. They chose to believe the good times would continue. They chose not to invest in continuous casting when they should have. They chose to fight foreign competition with politics instead of productivity. And when the inevitable arrived, they handed the bill to the 74,000 retirees who had earned their pensions with their bodies. That bridge they built is still there. The Empire State Building is still there. The ships that won World War II are scattered across museums and memory. Bethlehem Steel's work is everywhere. But the workers who made it, the men and women who ran those furnaces for 140 years, many of them spent their final decades waiting to find out whether their pension checks would keep arriving. Most did. Not all. And that should bother us. Because the America that built the Golden Gate Bridge was built on an implicit promise.
If this story stayed with you, if you think about the Golden Gate Bridge differently now, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Every week, we go inside the collapses that built the world we live in, the ones history textbooks reduce to a sentence. Subscribe. The next one is coming.